was the head of the Federal Reserve Bank, Alan Greenspan, who after 9/11 slashed interest rates to encourage lending. Bankers needed new participants to keep cash flowing into a system that had become a global pyramid scheme. All this newly created money entered the housing market and created unprecedented inflation. House prices rose and rose. New mothers were forced back into the workplace to service huge home loans, and the Anglo-American dream became all about land speculation.
The housing market in the West isn't about ownership. The housing market in the West, because it's the only way ordinary people can get ahead, and ordinary people can't get ahead but by wages. What we've created is a mass bubble economics around housing. As that sucks in a huge amount of capital, takes capital for genuine innovations in the economy, and puts it into a speculative use that has no genuine productive outcome.
It's interesting, if you talk to people in Germany, for example, they don't see a connection between owning a piece of property and they being inclined towards being democratic. There's lots of people who rent their housing there, and they're perfectly comfortable with that arrangement. But it is true that in somewhat different contexts, both Mr. Reagan and Mrs. Thatcher pushed for more people to own housing. And actually, this is part of the problem, because if you push people to buy housing before they're ready, and if you push very dubious loans on them, and they don't understand what they get themselves into, you can have huge adverse repercussions, exactly what led to, in part, the subprime housing crisis in the United States. That's not anything to do with democracy, that's just a bad economic idea.
The breakthrough that occurred around the year 2000 in the United States was when bankers found out that the poor are honest. And they realized that if you're poor, if you're not rich, you have a different set of values. And you think that a debt is a debt, and it's something that has to be paid, and that people will try to pay the debts that they're stuck with, even if the debts are not valid, even if the debts are much more than they expected, even if they really can't pay the debts.
The lending and banking institutions, when they drew up contracts with interest rates, with flexible interest rates, I think they knew in the beginning that these problems were going to come back later on, where folks weren't going to be able to afford the mortgages as the interest rates increased. They put a lot of people in situations where they were taking food out of refrigerators, taking kids out of higher education. They're not able to afford college anymore, and it is making a really, really bad situation worse.
The banks engaged in what was a criminal conspiracy to charge more to the blacks and Hispanics. The banks got together, backed the Bush administration to block the state prosecutions of racial lending in order to exploit and charge more to the minorities.
These were loans which were made by one of the major lenders in the city and in this country, Wells Fargo, in which Wells Fargo targeted minority communities in the city, put borrowers into loans that they could not afford, put borrowers into loans that were of the subprime variety, therefore more expensive and less advantageous to the borrowers.
Hiding predatory lending practices in the small print of complex financial products was only ever going to enrich one set of interests.
Many of the communities in which African Americans live in the city were establishing momentum. There was development activity that was occurring. We were seeing signs of vitality in many of these communities, and the results of the Wells Fargo foreclosures and the subprime lending practices of that lender and others has significantly impaired that progress and brought it to a halt.
What happened in Baltimore is just one example of what is happening all around the world. One way to frame this injustice is by branding it a race issue. But when we look really closely, we can see that there is something at play here that transcends race: profit.
The financial sector has acquired enormous power, partly through political contributions, so buying favors, but mostly through ideological control, convincing people that finance is good, more finance is better, and unregulated finance without limit is best. And that is really the cornerstone of this, what we call in the United States, the Wall Street-Washington corridor.
It's not a reflection of good democracy when a company, a group of companies, an industry, says our interests are more important than the national interest. How can that happen? Very easy. That's the role of campaign contributions, lobbying. in America's political structure. We have a flawed democracy.
There's an advanced oligarchy in the sense that its main mechanism of control, if you like, is through convincing people that you really need, for example, the 6 biggest banks in the United States in the particular form they exist today, with a very light level of regulation. And if you don't have them, if you try to change that, all kinds of awful things will happen. And this is not really blackmail. I mean, it sounds like blackmail, but they convince you it's not blackmail, it's just that's the way the world is. There's nothing you can do about it. Oh my goodness, you just have to cooperate with them. It's very clever.
The Fed is essentially the lobbyist for the commercial banking system. When you say you want to turn regulation over to the Fed, you're saying the financial sector and Wall Street should be self-regulated. And Wall Street has veto power over whoever is going to be the head of the Federal Reserve. As long as you give veto power over the regulators to Wall Street, as long as you pick the bank regulators from the banking industry itself, you can forget any thought of calling it regulation. It's deregulation, and to call it regulation instead of deregulation is using Orwellian doublethink.
Democracy is government by the people. Plutocracy is government by the rich. In a typical plutocratic state, economic inequality is high, social mobility low, and because of continuous exploitation of the masses, workers find it nearly impossible to climb out of poverty. The equal voting rights movement in the early 20th century abolished a system where rich people had more votes than poor people. But today, lobbying has put pay to that and reduced the American political system to a mere clearinghouse for the concerns of the rich.
The Goldman Sachs machine is one of using profits to buy influence in Washington to change laws to make it easier to make money on Wall Street to be used to buy influence in Washington. So it's a self-reinforcing malfeasance machine that is continuing to grow as a parasite in the economy and continuing to kill the host.
Famous for claiming it did God's work, Goldman Sachs is one of the most influential investment banks in the world.
Goldman Sachs are extremely efficient at what they do. Their task is to make money. They make bank robbers like Willie Sutton look like modest amateurs. They're huge bank robbers, but it's legal. The system is set up so that they can do it. In the recent years, they've been selling securities put together from mortgages that they knew were worthless. So they're selling these things to unwitting consumers, making a ton of money on it. Meanwhile, they're betting that they're going to fail because they know that what they're peddling is rotten. So they placed bets with it's called credit default swaps and other things with a huge insurance company, AIG, and that was insuring Goldman Sachs against the failure of the stuff they're peddling.
During America's subprime collapse, Goldman traders Michael Swenson and Josh Birnbaum made a $4 billion profit by short-selling junk mortgages. Backed by Dan Sparks, internally Goldman Sachs called their position the Big Short and bet against their own clients. Senator Carl Levin called Goldman Sachs chief executive Lloyd Blankfein to a Senate subcommittee to testify under oath.
Much has been said about the supposedly massive short Goldman Sachs had on the U.S. housing market. The fact is, we were not consistently or significantly net short the market in residential mortgage-related products in 2007 and 2008. We didn't have a massive short against the housing market, and we certainly did not bet against our clients.
Riding the Big Short in 2007 made billions of dollars for Goldman. And so far, they've got away scot-free with this massive heist.
So they're now back bigger than before, richer than before, biggest profits they've had in history, huge bonuses. They're doing great. A lot of what they're doing has, in fact, probably maybe all of it has almost nothing to do with the benefit of the economy.
Can there be any objection to genuinely talented people earning big money if they bring something new and tangible to the world? if they take great personal risks with their own money and actually bring greater prosperity for all. But how many of the general public have achieved greater prosperity through a banker's bonus? It was against the holy backdrop of St. Paul's Cathedral in London that Goldman Sachs Vice Chairman and mouthpiece Lord Griffiths gave insight into how certain bankers really think. The devoted Christian defended extortionate bonuses.
I'm not a person of despair, I'm a person of hope. And I think that we have to tolerate the inequality as a way to achieving greater prosperity and opportunity for all.
The fundamental Christian view, and I would say of Islam as well, and certainly of Judaism, is that wealth is to be shared. Money has to be shared. You can't take it with you. And from that develops a whole lot of stuff about justice and the economy and so on. And we've lost that, and instead we've got people accumulating more and more. And I just think it's disgusting that people have lost their homes, they lost their jobs, they can't pay their mortgages from bankers who made a big mistake and then paid enormous bonuses. I'm sorry, that is simply wrong. And I can't understand why we are not more vociferous about that.
When rich people tell you that they specifically have to be rich through these egregious rip-off mechanisms, that's just self-serving propaganda and it should be disregarded. It is true that when you organize human society, some people get ahead and some people struggle. That's a natural mechanism. But saying, oh, we've got to have inequality, therefore Goldman Sachs must be organized along the following lines, that's a complete non sequitur.
At what juncture, at what point does morality enter into the economic calculus? In a way, many people think that Adam Smith gave us a free pass, a way not to think about morality. Because what Adam Smith said was that individuals in the pursuit of their self-interest are led as if by an invisible hand to the general well-being of society. Now let me make it clear, Adam Smith didn't really say that. That is to say, Adam Smith was very much aware that businesses, when they got together, conspired against the public interest, raised prices. He was aware of monopoly. He was aware of the importance of education that the private sector couldn't provide. So he himself was aware of all the limitations, but his latter-day descendants have forgotten all those caveats.
Adam Smith was the godfather of classical economics, but since its publication, his work has been used as a political football, financiers twisting his words to suit them. Lord Griffiths advocates ruthless individualism to push this idea that if bankers get rich, then we get rich too, through a process known as trickle-down economics, or horse and sparrow theory. If you feed the horse enough oats, some will pass through to the road for the sparrows. The idea is that extreme wealth concentrated on a small minority will eventually trickle down to everyone else. But it doesn't work. Because by the time the money reaches the people at the bottom of our money pyramid, it's lost its purchasing power. But the public are now confused as to why our political leaders have allowed this to happen, and quite naturally now ask why.
Because our political processes are badly flawed. They're badly flawed because of the dependence on lobbyists, on campaign contributions. So that's why, my view, and a view I think of a lot of people, is that we have to restructure our political processes to give more voice to the ordinary citizen and less voice to the interest group, to the moneyed groups, to those who have taken such a large role in shaping our tax code, our regulatory regulations, and so forth.
I stood on the front step of Colin Powell's house, And I look at him and say, what next, boss? And he said, what do you mean? And I said, what next? Where are you going next? I'm going to write my book. I said, no, I know you're going to write your book, but you're not going to do that for the rest of your life. Where are you going next? He said, maybe a cabinet position, but first, money. I said, money? He said, yeah, millions. That's the only way you can be a cabinet officer in the American government. Oh, wow. The Democrats and the Republicans are beholden to corporate interests, and until they become unbeholden to those corporate interests, we will never have a well-governed republic.
The inherent iniquity in our system of money, banking and politics has not just had consequences domestically, but also on a massive scale globally. Western leaders have presented their military campaign in Iraq, Afghanistan and Pakistan as a moral obligation. But are there other reasons for it? The first financial beneficiary of America's foreign policy is the military. In particular, those who supply it with arms and equipment. The military has won wars, but how successful has it been in its bigger aim to eradicate terrorism?
The drone attacks not only failed, but they've created extra extremism. They've helped in radicalization of youth in the northwest frontier and also in certain parts of Punjab and Pakistan. And because time after time, and sometimes, you know, there's a feeling that America does this deliberately to destabilize Pakistan. I'm not so sure about that, but I certainly think those people who actually support this policy, every time you kill 10, the so-called terrorists, you create 500 more because they see the drone attacks as an attack on a sovereign state of Pakistan.
After the military, the next financial beneficiary are those who win the contracts to conduct the rebuilding process. In the West, people might even feel optimistic when they hear that the US is pumping tens of billions of newly created dollars into developing nations to build infrastructure. But often this too doesn't seem to achieve the publicized goals. Is there another reason we give these countries aid?
We economic hitmen have created the world's first truly global empire, and we've done it primarily without the military. We work many different ways, but perhaps the most common is that we'll take a third world country that has resources our corporations covet, like oil, and then arrange a huge loan to that country from the World Bank or one of its sister organizations. However, the money never actually goes to the country. Instead, it goes to our own corporations to build infrastructure projects in that country, power plants, highways, industrial parks, things that benefit a few wealthy families in that country as well as our corporations, but don't help the majority of the people at all. They're too poor to buy electricity or drive cars on the highways. They don't have the skills to get jobs in industrial parks. But they're left holding a huge debt.
Infrastructure which has used heavy loans from the World Bank and IMF and made from grants from Western countries, they've all gone into benefiting the elite and the feudal classes. They have not benefited the people.
The masses have very little already. So those landlords who have the infrastructure and who are going to make money because of the infrastructure that is built through their roads, they will prosper. But the ones who don't have any resources, they've not had jobs, there isn't an economic activity for them in terms of manufacturing goods so they can sell and they can also prosper. When you don't have that, what do? They resort to joining the Taliban because they see the enemy coming in and taking away what little bit they have.
President Obama, I understand, wants to invest $7.5 billion in Pakistan's infrastructure to alleviate poverty and, take away all the divisions and all the anti-American sentiment over here. Whatever his reasons are, we can do without it. In fact, it's the worst possible thing he can do. This kind of help is actually going to be a hindrance. It's just going to make matters worse. It will bring this contrived war and terror into our rural areas.
How much of US foreign policy is genuinely altruistic? And how much is it influenced by the banks and corporations that profit so tremendously from it?
America's evangelism of democracy is riddled with contradictions, not least of which this idea of promoting democracy at the point of a gun, or opposing regimes which are democratic but not in the way that America wants. So too, this idea that America has been promoting free market capitalism has also been riddled with contradictions, because the reality is that American firms tend to make most money when countries are at the cusp of change, certainly American financial firms, and in a sense they want markets that are changing structurally, but not too free and too transparent, because they make money when markets are a bit opaque.
Is it any wonder developed nations are fighting in underdeveloped countries when so many are making so much money out of it, without ever really having to face up to or even witness the consequences of their actions?
So what if 5 million kids died in Africa because of debt last year? I got a bonus of £1 million, and if I have that conversation, I've had it with some bankers who've been in the business a long time, and they listen politely, very polite, very charming, and at the end they say, well, Tariq, it's lovely meeting you again, and they go back to the office and do another loan deal for Tanzania or something.
I've known a lot of terrorists, quote unquote. I've met them, I've interviewed them for books, I've known them since I was an economic hit, and I've never met one who wanted to be a terrorist. They all want to be with their families back on the farm. They're driven to terrorism because they've lost the farm. It's been inundated with water from a hydroelectric project or with oil from oil derricks. Their farm's been destroyed. They can't make a living for their kids. Or in the case of the Somali pirates, their fishing waters have been destroyed. And that's why they've turned to this. It isn't because they want to be pirates or terrorists. Now, there may be a few crazy people. There are a few crazy people with their nuts loose. There'll always be serial killers. There'll always be crazy people. Maybe Osama bin Laden's one of them. But they do not get a following unless there's a terrible injustice going on. And people are starving and they're deprived. And then they will follow these crazy people because they seem to offer an alternative.
What does the word terrorist actually mean? Many terrorists would sooner describe themselves as freedom fighters. Could it be that the charge of terrorism could just as easily be made against Western corporations, speculators and policymakers?
When we talk about terrorism, it means what they do to us, not what we do to them. And what they do to us can be pretty ugly, although it's not even a fraction of what we do to them. I mean, take, say, 9/11. That was a pretty serious act of terrorism, maybe the worst single act of terrorism in history. But it could have been worse. I mean, suppose, for example, that Al-Qaeda had bombed Washington, bombed the White House. It killed the president, installed a harsh military dictatorship, brought in a bunch of economists who drove the economy into its worst disaster in history. Well, that would have been worse than 9/11. And I'm not making it up. It happened. What's called the first 9/11 in South America, namely in Chile.
On the 11th of September 1973, the democratically elected Chilean president Salvador Allende was overthrown in a coup. A dictatorship under Augusto Pinochet was established that ruled Chile until 1990. There was the systematic suppression of all political dissidents. Thousands were imprisoned and murdered.
Who was involved in that first 9/11? It's not hard to find them. Right in Washington and London and so on. But that's off the agenda. It doesn't count. There's a principle of ideology that we must never look at our own crimes. We should, on the other hand, exult in the crimes of others and in our own nobility in opposing them.
root causes of so-called terrorism will not be solved by increasing economic inequality. If governments really are serious about combating terrorism, then they must start with real structural reform back home. As long as banking empires chase infrastructure and debt deals in pursuit of profit, the West will continue to export injustice through finance. Millions more will be displaced, terrorism will thrive, and neo-colonialism will continue to end more and more lives around the world.